Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you at our inaugural SIDGE Symposium, the Center for Social Impact, Development, and Global Engagement at the Northern California, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Community Foundation. Good morning, everyone. Glad to have you at our... I was listening to myself. See, I like listening to myself. But the Center for Social Impact, Development, and Global Engagement looks at ethics and artificial intelligence. Ethics and artificial intelligence. That's part of our center. It was birthed out of our King and Faith Symposium that was co-founded by Dwight Nathaniel Hopkins at the University of Chicago and the folks here at the NorcalMLK Foundation to look at ethics and artificial intelligence. And we have a group of scholars and thinkers here that I think will help launch our journey into this space. Bit of housekeeping. This is our Martin Luther King season. So we celebrate Martin Luther King here in the San Francisco Bay Area with a bevy of events. And the SIDGE Symposium is launching those events. So if you want to know more about our events here in the San Francisco Bay Area, simply go to SFMLK, San Francisco Martin Luther King, SFMLK.events to see all of the things that we are doing here. So let me get to the panel. I'm so pleased to have some of my colleagues, but these are the leading thinkers in their spaces. And we're so honored to have them this morning to inaugurate our new SIDGE Symposium. Our first guest, as many of you may know, is digital media scholar and 2021 MacArthur Genius Grant recipient. She's also the director of the Center for Race and Digital Justice at UCLA. It's Safiya Noble. Hello, Safiya.
Hi, thank you so much, Aaron, for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
We're honored to have you. Good to see you again. I think the last time we saw each other was at the ALA, the American Library Association.
No, it's been a minute.
San Francisco. It's been a minute. You know, I was Black. Now I'm gray. So it's been a minute there. Our next guest is Professor and Vice Provost of Public Interest Technology. He's also the executive director of the Tech for Humanities Initiative at Virginia Tech. His name is Sylvester Johnson, my friend. Sylvester, how are you?
Great. Thanks so much for having me on. Glad to be here.
Great to see you again. The last time we saw each other was last month at the
American Academy of Religion, right?
Academy of Religion Conference, AAR. Our next guest is a very innovative thinker in this space. He's a theologian and assistant professor of Black posthuman artificial intelligence systems and theology at Iliff School of Theology there in Denver, Colorado. Philip Butler, how are you, Phil?
No, I'm doing okay. I'm glad to be here with everyone today. It's good to see you again, Aaron.
Good to see you. All right, so let's dig in to this question of ethics and artificial intelligence. And we want to start sort of at the foundation. We want to get an idea of how sort of artificial intelligence makes its emergence, how it does what it does. And we want to start in this area of algorithms. Safiya, I know you've written an entire work and you've centered a lot of your work on algorithms. Your book, Algorithms of Oppression, is very impactful in the space. It was one of the inspirations behind launching our SIDGE Center. Talk to us a bit about, one, algorithms as the driving force behind what we see in artificial intelligence, and then sort of lay the foundation of what are those disjunctions that you saw in your work that you highlighted there in your work.
Great. I'm happy to do that. And first, let me just say, I'm joining you today from the Tonga Gabrielino people's land, which has not been ceded here in Southern California and Los Angeles. And it's so important that we're having these kinds of conversations that are about not just our solidarities with other oppressed people, but also the way in which oppression is changing and becoming even more opaque and difficult. And that really is what led me to my own inquiries and studies about artificial intelligence and algorithms and kind of the role they play in Black life. Let me just start by saying it's amazing that we can have a panel like this and talk about algorithms and AI. And I'm sure most of the people watching this feel like they're a little bit in on that conversation. I mean, we are living now in a time where algorithm, even the word algorithm is not just a kind of a discrete type of jargon for computer scientists, but in fact, it's a colloquial term that we've started to kind of incorporate into our life, like, cracking the code, or what's the algorithm of our lives, or of a particular experience, right? So I attribute that, in fact, to Black scholars and feminist scholars and LGBTQ scholars and journalists who, for a decade, more than a decade, we have been pushing this conversation about what does it mean when kind of directions that are given to a computer, which is really what an algorithm is, calculate and derive certain types of, let's say, positions or articulations that have impact on marginalized people's lives. When I started in this work, it was more than a decade ago. I remember it started by looking at search engines. I was in library and information science Ph.D. program at Illinois, and I was thinking and listening to all of the librarians and knowledge managers who were so thrilled about the emergence of something like a search engine, and equally some of them concerned about, would search engines displace other forms of knowledge like libraries and teachers and professors, people like all of us here, knowledge workers, grandmas, all the type of people who help us learn and who help us discern wisdom. And here we had like kind of the rise of Google. And I just started my own queries by looking to see how were these types of kind of artificially intelligent, algorithmic driven systems representing Black people and Black life. And of course, this was where it became so clear very quickly, and probably one of the most, infamous now searches was a search on Black girls that yielded, 80% pornography. Even though you didn't have to add the word sex, or you didn't have to add the word porn, Black women and girls were synonymous with pornography. And that really was a thread that I pulled on, and have continued to work on over the past 12 years or more, to help us understand, like, what does it mean when directions are given to a computer, and these are the types of results that come back. Who is writing those algorithms? What are their values? What are the things that are being overlooked? Who is, in fact, a commodity in these systems? And of course, one of the things we know is that Black life and Black culture and Black people are the ultimate American commodity. And, from the inception of our time, on these shores. And that continues in the way in which we are commodified, sold, and, kind of ensconced in racism and sexism, because that's big business in America. And so these are the kinds of things that I think are really important when we talk about what are the types of instructions that are given to computers to make decisions about Black people's lives, not just our representation, but even beyond, when it comes to whether we're mortgage worthy, whether we should get housing, whether we should have access to education, whether we should have access to healthcare. Increasingly, computers and computational decision-making is the gatekeeper around those kinds of issues. And what we see more and more is this kind of opaque erosion of our civil rights that are being ceded to machines. And I know my colleagues here will have a lot to say about this as we think about not just the kind of intentional algorithms that are programmed, but then as we get into machine learning, where humans are not in the loop, in fact, in the kinds of datafication and decision-making and sorting and modeling around the future of all people of humanity. But I will put a finer point on the fact that Black people in particular, and working class and poor people, have been the beta test, kind of the testing ground for some of the worst kinds of algorithmic decision-making. And to me, that means, we have to keep a very close eye because the makers of many of these systems and kind of big tech writ large, finds us to be a disposable consumer base and upon which they can experiment. And I think these are the kinds of things that I'm so grateful for your center and that we can have these conversations now.
Phil, thank you for that. Phil, I want to touch on that in just a second because of some of your work, and particularly in machine learning and how you're trying to work through that with your space. I want to jump to you in a moment. But Sylvester, you have an interesting, in connection with this, you have an interesting position and vantage point, because at Virginia Tech, what you're launching, this public interest technology, has a connection specifically here with what Safiya has highlighted. Give us a little overview of how that plays out in your new space there.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So Safiya's description of this challenge is very exquisite, and I think really revealing for understanding the complexities that happen with the innovation of systems that can generate some very sophisticated outcomes that I think even 15, 20 years ago, many people doubted. The fact that you can have something you wear on your wrist to use to navigate if you're walking, or most of us just plug our phones into our car and we can go somewhere we've never been before and get there. But as she was describing, there are tremendous social costs to the way the tech has been developed, because all the different examples that she gave was how the innovation has been put to use, typically, not always, but typically, usually in service primarily to the interest of private capital. And public interest technology is concerned with the interest of the public, right? If we think about the way law has worked, public interest tech has emerged as a growing discipline in large measure because of the Ford Foundation. In the 60s, they found ways to try to get people who had expertise in law to work for human rights, social justice. And today we take for granted that federal agencies have attorneys or that human rights organizations function in this way. That we've had lots of successes that are important in civil rights, human rights, because of the work that legal experts have rendered. But that was not random, and it's not always been that way. It was because of concerted efforts to create more pathways for professionals to serve not only the interests of private capital, but also the interests of the public. And so the same effort is being made with technology today. How do we move beyond the typical pattern where the accountability is mostly to private shareholders or private wealth, and move into a new phase of innovation where it's not necessarily against the importance of looking at the growth of private capital, but rather not setting up the zero-sum game where that funding and the cycles of prosperity growth are defined in opposition to the public, but rather that we're advancing and setting at the top the importance of benefits for a human society, for civil rights, for human rights, for systems of justice. There are many ways that can happen. At Virginia Tech, we're one of about 48 colleges and universities in the US that are part of a consortium, a public interest technology university network. That's administered by the New America think tank that has been supporting that consortium with extensive funding from the Ford Foundation and from other philanthropic organizations. that have focused on the need to get us to the point where we're actually creating a world we want to live in, and we're not just riding along with the inertia of how venture capital, of how the investment vehicles for privileging the growth of private capital have usually functioned. And that can happen in many ways. Some of it is preparing the future talent to make sure that the students who are going to be responsible for the innovation that's happening in our society are actually studying about the human side of technology and not only technical systems. Some of it is expanding what a technologist even is. Like who gets to count as a technologist? Usually that's been STEM only. That's no longer sufficient. Some of the most important leadership that we need for an innovation economy and an innovation society has to be in humanistic disciplines and humanistic areas. So I think this panel displays some of those combinations, but much more broadly, we need people who have a lot of expertise in systems of inequality, and they understand structures and processes of democratic institutions and democratic governance, or they have a global lens on the movement of capital systems and vehicles and wealth, and they understand what's needed to get a shared prosperity. So those types of expertise are as essential to the future of an innovation society as are the technical methods of expertise. And so public interest technology is also concerned with redefining who and what gets to count. And then some of it isn't about the kinds of collaborations that we have. You know, we have to move to the point of taking some of the richness that has emerged in the sophisticated analysis of our challenges and translate some of that, and that's thrived in our academic institutions and in some think tanks, for example, and in human rights organizations. And we have to translate that into the levels of expertise and power in government, in private corporations that are still chiefly the engines of innovation, so that we're not just waiting for things to happen and then critiquing it. We're actually shaping what happens by already having as the arbiters those who have a cultivated commitment to public interest.
Interesting. That's I want to delve into that a bit more as we sort of enter our colloquy. Phil, you have a program there at Iliff that attempts to tackle this issue of machine learning and change from the end of big data, right? So this Black posthuman artificial intelligence systems, give us an idea of how you're trying to tackle one of the machine learning issues and the big data point of entrance into this argument.
Sure. So at Iliff and at the AI Institute, we have a couple of things that we're doing, and so most of it is under this umbrella that we're naming the 80-20 project, right? And so we're thinking about global demographics, where the majority of the world is made up of folks that are not white. And so in this framing, right, we're looking at, trying to create data sets that are more reflective of not only the global population, but also are privileging these the folks who are embodied in this way as well. So the 80-20 project is split into kind of two different projects, one on the computer vision side, and then the other one on the natural language processing side. And so on the computer vision side, one of the things that we're attempting to do, kind of building off of Joy Bolamani and Timothy Cabrew's work around looking at making sure the computers can see dark-skinned folks, and specifically dark-skinned women. We want to build off of this and then go what we see as a couple steps further. Firstly, kind of reinserting the human back into the loop, as kind of Safiya was talking about it in this way. We want to give folks the opportunity, right, to self-label their data, right? So specifically like the biometrics that they contribute to a data set. So there's a consent-based model that we're working on putting together that has kind of implications for data ownership. And so when folks would contribute to this particular project, they would not only own the data, but we would ask them to self-identify, right? And so the goal of this particular piece in terms of around the self-identification is namely to get computers to see people as computers see themselves. And we recognize that there's a difference between kind of facial recognition whereby it knows that it's you, right? This is Philip that is seeing versus facial detection, where it can see folks and recognize that people that look like Philip and are able to be kind of recognized. So we know that there is some space in between, the formation of this project and its production, but at the same time, we still want to kind of bypass the more racist and discriminatory labeling models and systems that have happened and are continuing to happen today. And so within this framing, within the computer vision space, we want to, again, give people ownership of what they contribute. I think similar to what Sylvester was talking about in terms of this kind of public interest space, and what does it mean then for people to not only be participants within the process of building data sets and the models off of their data sets, but also recognizing that the people are the very thing that the computers need in order to do what computers need to do. And so we hope that this has kind of policy implications, and let alone we want to kind of challenge the ways in which people's data has not only been siphoned, but also has been kind of a new basis of profiting, right, for these larger companies. Specifically, we're thinking about like some of the FANG companies and the ways in which, we've seen with Cambridge Analytica and so on and so forth, and even Google's having their issues as they're becoming a bit more prevalent in terms of the ways that they're taking people's information and then profiting and benefiting off of that without the people being able to benefit off of that. So we're thinking about what happens in the world when people have the opportunity to share in that revenue that is being kind of built off of their backs, right? I think I had a conversation about a couple of months ago around the idea of data being cotton in this way. And so thinking about this kind of this form of not only Black labor in the data sphere, but also the ways in which this data has its own kind of multi-billion-dollar tag tied to it, but also recognizing that within all of this, there's very real people on the other end. But on the natural language processing side, we are kind of starting with building out this Black language model, which is based off of Black literature. We're putting together, compiling a data set of Black literature from over the last 100 years, whether it be plays, speeches, novels, books, so on and so forth, as a means to construct a concept of what, kind of Black consciousness in this way, but also Black vernacular and Black language as a means of self-referentiation, right? So like if the good amount of the models that we have today that are based on language, are kind of taken from either Twitter or Reddit or synthetic data that is still based upon those kind of highly racist and discriminatory modes of conversation that also privilege whiteness, then we're also thinking about the ways and what it means then to have a language model that privileges Blackness and understands itself as that understands the ways in which Black folks understand themselves. And so becoming this kind of foundational element that we then will build transformers and different language models on top of, right? So you can think about, I think one of the easiest use cases we're thinking about is, and not just kind of tech generation, but like if we think about the ways in which Black folks kind of get flagged for, breaking community guidelines, what does it mean then to have a data set that is grounded in Black vernacular that understands the contextual elements of the ways in which Black people speak, and then recognizing the ways in which that could make room for the fluidity in which Black folks express themselves in these different platforms, as opposed to kind of immediately flagging, Black speech and Black kind of Black digital communities for, not adhering to this kind of universalist, predominantly kind of white-leaning modes of communication. And so these are kind of some of the two of the ways in which we're looking at it within kind of this larger umbrella of the 80/20 project, right at Iliff.
So thank you for that, because it brings up something that I'm thinking about regarding sort of the layers that have to be weeded through here. We've got this, when I'm thinking about it in my mind, we've got this algorithmic layer where it's an equation, and these equations have these various variables, and these variables are weighted to come out with the whole that is required for an algorithm, right? You want this end product, and you use these variables and you adjust these variables to get to your desired outcome. Well, and then you have this AI side that as a part of these, these algorithms that provide the instructions for what AI is going to do, right? you've got this whole other side to it that is very impactful. And I want to sort of circle back with you, Safiya, to in some of your research, what have you found that sort of at its core in this algorithmic sort of framework that at its very core doesn't look at Black folk, doesn't look at brown folk, doesn't look at women, doesn't look at Black women, doesn't look at brown women, doesn't look at Black girls. It comes out with this equation that would yield something that you found when you put Black girls into a Google search. You know, what is that you sort of found in your research that
I think the contribution that I tried to make to this conversation early on is that data is a social construct. First of all, it is not really just mathematical equations and representations, and in the way that algorithms were kind of understood in the before times, before people like us were doing our work, was that it was simply math. At the bottom, the bottom line is that algorithms were just mathematical expressions. And I think what the humanists and social scientists have done is we have shown that, first of all, math is a language. Languages are subjective, and they are full of meaning and interpretation and values. And you cannot escape that when you're talking about the development of representational, conceptual theorems and ideas to represent society and humanity and people and communities. And that, I think, Philip, has done a marvelous job of helping us really understand procedurally, in fact, how these things get encoded in data sets and labeled and then acted upon. And those are all incredibly labor-intensive human endeavors, in fact, that are very important to interpret correctly. In fact, what we typically have are data scientists who use data sets that they can get from anywhere. And it's true, whether it's Reddit or Twitter or the Urban Dictionary or any one of many racist data sets on the internet that are used as a proxy for Black people, those are incredibly value laden. And they also many times they flatten the power analysis, in fact, so that we don't understand, for example, when a financial institution is using historical financial data from the public to make decisions about creditworthiness, and its algorithm gives women 1/10 of the credit that it gives their husbands who have the exact same financial profile. And of course, this is a very famous case of the Apple credit card. Customer service is called and they say, well, the algorithm just decided, without understanding that, for example, my own mother couldn't have a bank account in her name unless her husband or her father co-signed on it. And women couldn't have financial independence in terms of banking and credit until the 1980s, and really, really not fully implemented until the 90s. So that would then help us understand a history of discriminatory data sets that are seemingly benign, but get pulled into models and used to determine worthiness. Now, for me, I think the interventions are many. I mean, certainly we need better labeling and we need a better power analysis and descriptors and all of those kinds of things about data. We also need to have the ability to refuse. We need abolition in some of these spaces, because moving into an era of, I like to describe it as we were previously in the era of a struggle for representation. In television, in Hollywood, movies, music, art, society broadly, laws, civil rights laws are also about this kind of politics of representation. I I think we are living now in an era where we will be battling around the politics of classification, how we are classified, how we are described, how those descriptors then over-determine what is possible for us. And we see this with babies who are already being put into data systems. We see our children in schools who are constantly surveilled and monitored, how much their eye movement is focused on the screen, the proctoring of exams. I mean, you name it. I mean, we could just go for hours, honestly, on the surveillance mechanisms that are all around us, with or without our approval, knowledge, or consent, understanding. And all of those are really coming into thousands of systems that are being, where that data is being sold and brokered 24/7 in real-time markets. And we have no idea what our data profiles are. So in some spaces where we have controlled data sets that we can create, we hope we will have long-term control over those things. But in reality, in everybody's everyday reality, it is true that all kinds of biometric and other types of information is being collected on us. We have data profiles that stand as a proxy for who we are in the world. And of course, the public doesn't want this, because when they survey the public and ask them, would you want your search results? This is just one data source that's collected on us. Would you want your search results to be known to your employer or your spouse or your family? Everybody says no, absolutely not. I mean, overwhelmingly, nobody wants that. They want the kind of freedom to explore, the freedom to read, the freedom to know and inquire without having judgments made about that. But of course, all of those things go into the making of a data profile about us. And those things exist without any oversight. There's no regulation, there's no legal protections for the public. And of course, we know who will end up faring the worst. Every week, we have headlines in the news. We have new scholarly reports coming out, articles, books, helping us understand the stakes and the consequences and who's losing in this kind of new age of classification. So, for me, I think this is the 21st civil rights issue. I mean, at least it is for me to work on. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that the datafication of us it will be the most important human rights issue of this century. And that probably sounds ridiculous to a lot of people, I mean, that, we have colleagues who just, would argue against that, but we know when we look at the outcome of what these systems are doing, and I think machine learning and predictive analytics for me is the most egregious dimension of what we're talking about. We really should abolish even the phrase artificial intelligence, because I think it's a Hollywood construct, in the imaginary of the public. It really obfuscates the crude way. I mean, Philip, this, right? That, computers are still trying to figure out if, like this table that I'm sitting at is the same as the dining room table, as the same as my standing desk. It's real sketchy in terms of what we think is so incredibly intelligent about these systems that we're engaging with. And I guess part of the question we will have to ask ourselves is, are we working to refine these systems? Are we working to abolish these systems? Are we working to regulate these systems? Should we be doing all of these things? What's our strategy in terms of care for the collective of humanity and, of course, for oppressed people? And there are many people, there's a vast spectrum right now that's emerging, and people have different ideas about what the interventions should be. But it's a very important set of conversations that we need to be struggling around for the next many, many years and lifetimes.
So Sylvester, you talked about, we were speaking a bit ago, and you talked about how the humanities and what Safiya was mentioning, how the humanities is how this sort of the humanities space is the space now where we are highlighting these problems, and that you found something interesting around, you know, in order to make these, in order to bring this issue sort of full circle, what the humanities is now, you know, becoming a focus in the space of technology. You pick up on that a bit there.
Yes, absolutely. So thanks for that question, because it gets to one of, I think it's a really great example of a tension that's also an opportunity for addressing some of these bigger challenges we have. So I, among other things, I'm a scholar of humanities and direct a Center for Humanities, and can attest that there are lots of conversations about what gets to count as humanities. If you have 12 humanists, you'll have 15 or 20 definitions of what that is. But there can be summarized as a tendency to look back on some things that might get called classical and say, well, that's the essence of humanities. We need to read texts that have been written and enjoyed for centuries and that deal with classic questions. And then there are people who've done work, think about the 1960s and 70s and 80s, looking at race, gender, indigeneity, sexuality, for example, who have been part of humanities and social sciences, and they have focused more on trying to understand systems of power as something that's essential to humanity and to understanding the human conditions, and not in the zero-sum fashion, but just more of trying to understand where we might point the lever to try to understand where the center of gravity is for humanities. Technology, the study of technology as a human issue, as a human problem, is a more recent iteration of a set of conversations in humanities. It's also trying to understand what is the place of this set of disciplines in our world, where we're used to seeing an easy divide between things that are STEM, meaning science, technology, engineering, and math, and things that are, and everything else, things that are not STEM. So to think about this intersection of humanities and technology is to appreciate that those conversations that have tried to understand what humanity should be concerned with have been ongoing, that the engagement with technology is, broadly speaking, a more recent part of that history of trying to discern how humanists should do their work. I like to emphasize humanities through humanistic, human-centered. That's what our center does. I think that it's not that everybody needs to study X, right? There's no one thing I think everyone needs to study, but I do think it will, for anyone who's thoughtful about systems of power, about the most fundamental questions of human rights, of social justice, of the very operations of institutions that might be considered foundational to human thriving and democratic outcomes, it will certainly be necessary to engage with technology, and not just in a casual way, but I think in a very foundational and a very central way. So what Safiya was just saying about this being a question for human rights of our time, I don't think is at all hyperbole. I think that is a very good example of trying to understand that. And so just to give an example, if we think about some of these issues and questions that are central to humanities, that over time have come to center on questions of human justice, social justice, not for every humanist, but for critical mass, and particularly centers and consortia of humanities that try to explain to the world why it's important in the 21st century for our students and a public to study humanities. The answer to that rejoinder is usually around these issues, because we have to have a society that works for everyone, and we need people to understand these issues. So if you think about the future of healthcare, or the present, forget the future, the present of healthcare, and what was being referred to earlier, the importance of being able to get control over collection and analysis of data. The future of medicine, and to some degree the present of medicine, is not N equals 50,000. Your healthcare products are based on huge populations, but upon an individual's genetics If you're treating cancer, cancer is your own cells. It's not a foreign invasion. It's your own cells that have started to perform in a way that causes severe problems that can be fatal. And so your cancer is specific to your DNA, and the best way to fight your cancer is to do something that works specifically for your genetics. And that's just not cancer, that's all kinds of things. Like the drugs are going to be increasingly designed for individuals. And it creates a very complicated kind of issue. The National Institutes of Health right now is trying to get more people of color to provide their genetic information to these big, massive data banks that are going to get used for the future of what's called precision medicine. Let's make more medicines that work for people individually instead of giving a bunch of people medicines that don't work for most of them. And so what was just described earlier is a very good example of why this is a really difficult problem. There's a lot of reticence for historical reasons among communities of color when it comes to people collecting their medical information. You know, think of Tuskegee and other things, the Tuskegee experiment. And one could also imagine a situation where if the future of medicine is precision, then if the people who are going to be best served by that future are the people whose information is actually being used to generate the medicines. And if you're not included in those data systems, then you're not going to get the best access to the healthcare. But on the other hand, who's in charge of these data systems?
Right.
Who's maintaining them and whose software is analyzing them? And so I don't think the answer to that question is obvious or a solution is obvious. But if the supreme accountability is not to systems of fairness and justice, if it's mostly being driven by how to best increase the growth rates of private capital, which is what we've been doing, by the way, that's how most of our technology has proceeded. And if it's mostly in service to techno-nationalism, meaning we've got to beat the Soviet Union or we've got to beat China, and so that's going to be the source of most of our federal funding, and the source of it is not being driven mainly by how we're going to get equity and fairness and justice, then we will only end up with a system that's going to exacerbate the inequalities and the racism and the sexism. So that's one way of thinking about the role of humanists in this future, that for people who've cultivated so much expertise with understanding the human condition, with understanding human systems, we have to have more leadership from humanists broadly conceived when it comes to leading our technology, whether we're going to do abolition work, whether we're going to change the direction of certain product development, whether we're going to develop a regulatory framework, because we mostly don't have regulatory frameworks around digital technology systems in the US. We're way behind the EU, for example. Mm-hmm. It has to have the leadership come increasingly from including humanists and not simply default to STEM is what we need and only STEM leadership and only the STEM experts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Phil, your work is really working through sort of the lens of data sets, but this connection that you have as a theologian and as putting together these data sets. Talk to us just a bit about how that link between sort of this humanistic endeavor and this theological endeavor comes together with this sort of data set project, this artificial intelligence project that you put together there at Iliff briefly. Give us what that nexus looked like. What brought you to that space?
That's a great question. The answer is not necessarily a simple one, right? So we've been throwing the word human around a lot, and like I don't necessarily identify as human. I don't think anybody's a human. I think human is another one of those social constructs that is kind of a cybernetic of whiteness, right? In terms of its stratification and distribution, kind of in the social and legislation space. And so, like for me, in a post-humanist framing, right? I lean more towards the term people, and I know the folks can call me, kind of, or say that I'm engaging in semantics, but here's the differentiation. Especially, I think, what's kind of building off what Sylvester just said, right, about these kind of global or universal approaches to like a quote unquote a human condition, right? So that suggests that we have this kind of universal construction of what a human is. But if we know that the idea of human and the construction of technology or products for humans has not been and doesn't and continues to not necessarily be for Black folks, as an example, right? Then we're talking about a specific type of human and a specific type of archetype that we are framing our world around. And if that's the case, then again, that also becomes a very real indicator of the localized version of a particular type of body and social framework that we are constructing the world towards. And so when I say if a human is a universal construct, then a person or a people, these are local and complex beings that come from somewhere. They have ancestral lineage. They are connected to the land in a certain way. They have specific bodies, right? There's complexity in their embodiment, right? We can talk about people's pronouns. We can talk about people's orientation. We can talk about how people want to see themselves and how people want to be seen. And so when we talk about this from the perspective of a person, and I like the way this conversation has been going, it kind of sets me up in a pretty good way. So I appreciate both of you all for what you've been saying, and mainly because kind of building off this precision space, if precision medicine is becoming more granular, then for me, the future of artificial intelligence, or whatever we decide to call this thing, if we take what Safiya is saying seriously, right? It's not about precision. It's not about prediction, but I think it is about precision, which tells us that the technology ought to be built in a more localized fashion. So what does it mean to build solutions for people, right, in the Antelope Valley, or for people in the foothills of Colorado, or for people who, from the north side of the DMV versus the southern side of the DMV, or from Baltimore, who are 45 minutes away, but have a different cultural kind of outlook altogether. And so what does it mean then to approach these technological solutions for localized sets of people, and let alone for the granular aspects of individualized peoples within these particular collectives? And so when we talk about this kind of theological framing, I'm always kind of curious about this, because within a post-humanist framework, at least within a Black post-humanist framework, the one that I come from, right, I call into question the notion not only of whether or not this divine figure is somewhere else, but I also call into question the notion of whether the divine figure is actually the center of our cosmological orientation. If the human, as we see this kind of universal construct, is always in need of saving, or always in need of a second chance, or this kind of like replaced or propped back up in a specific space, then it's not necessarily God that's at the center, it's the human. And if the human is always at the center, then we're still trying to figure out ways to buttress this particular figure over against nature. And so this oppositional framing, again, puts us in a different kind of orientation altogether. So if we're looking at people, and the complexities of people and the histories of people, in the various ways in which multiple types of deities, pantheons, so on and so forth, have shown up, then we're also looking at the relationship between people and divinity, and not necessarily kind of the need for a particular type of arbiter. And so if that's the case, right, then we're looking at honoring the divinities within individualized peoples within this particular type of biology, let alone the types of personhood that comes from the cobalt that makes our machines, let alone, the mountains of the earth, and so on and so forth, which offers us an invitation into a different type of relationship with the various materials that we utilize, or that we say we're in a relationship with when it comes to building the types of, kind of reorientations of nature, right? Our computers, our phones, our clothes, these are all reorientations of nature. So it's still natural because it can be done, right? But it's not necessarily, I think part of the dichotomy here is that if it's man-made, it's not nature. But I also push back in saying that each one of us was put together in a particular type of lab, whether it was a test tube or in somebody's bedroom or not. There was a formation that was done by people to make us, and so even we are the production of people in that sort. All of that to say that when I think about theology, even though I don't necessarily talk about God on a regular basis, I'm thinking about this in more of a cosmological, systematic framework. And so, what are the various systems that are interlocking that allow for us to be here today, but also conceptualize the world and be part of various realities in the multidimensional space. And so when we think about our an orientation towards new types of relationships, then I think this is part of the impetus for reframing what it means to think about the various ways in which people contribute not only to the constructs of data, but also to the constructs of society, but also the ways in which we can reconfigure, reimagine, whether it be through an abolitionist, a regulationist, a regulation space, or even a kind of a redoing of things. But I think in many ways, we're calling into question, especially when we start talking about various types of folks, whether it be Black folks, Chicano folks, like Asian American folks, so on and so forth. What does it mean for them to have localized solutions in the various ways in which they show up, whether it be regionally, area dependent, so on and so forth? And so what does it mean to have a type of technology that reflects oneself back onto oneself, not just in a self-grandizing way, but in a way that lovingly allows for self-reflection and this kind of sculpting of oneself into maybe something different. Doesn't necessarily have to be better, but it allows us to be different with ourselves, let alone, you know, with the people that we find ourselves in relationship with.
So Safiya, jump on that in a few minutes. This
Sorry.
is what always happens. You get there and you're ready to go, and you got a few minutes left. So give us a bit of a response to that. And you would mention that, hey, you know, you think this is sort of our civil rights issue of the time that we need to tackle. Give us some response to what you've got and what you're hearing here from your vantage in your space.
First of all, I love this conversation. I don't want it to end. So let me just say that. And I'm not going to get to say everything I want to say because of the time. But I 100% agree that what we're talking about fundamentally is that you cannot flatten people into data that becomes a very thin type of representation of the complexity of people's spirits. And I'm going to be very conscious now about saying human, because I really appreciated that. So if that's the case, then we have to ask ourselves, what is this project that's underway called artificial intelligence, right, or machine learning, and all of these things that are quasi-representational, that are working in service, in fact, of powerful people who do, in fact, hold kind of techno-eugenicist ideas about the world. I mean, gosh, go actually learn something about Elon Musk. Go actually learn something about the Silicon Valley giants and their worldview about who is disposable, why they have their, kids who are named like robots, and why they're having 21 kids, and why they want to have, a future that actually does not include the people that they think are genetically and otherwise inferior, which is all of us, by the way, on this call. So I think we want to be smart about power and worldview that is underway by the hands, in the hands of the people who control not only the capital, but the implementations and and are kind of marshaling these and misrepresenting also these many, many projects that they endeavor to bring into existence in the world. And so that means that, reform and regulation, that's just like the tip of the iceberg. What we're talking about is worldviews that are about the integrity and divinity of people. And I truly believe that, Philip, you're really nailing it. I mean, we really just need to have a conference just about your work and what you're talking about right now, because it's opening up the real conversations about what these projects are that I think is, again, fraudulent and, goes against the possibilities for people. And we have to contend with that and ask ourselves, is it worth it that we, put the phone in the recycling bin and, it creates crisis in the world from, mining and extraction all the way through waste. And we know who pays the price of that. and in colonial terms. I mean, it is very raw and harsh in the way that colonization has always been. And these are projects of colonization too. There's just no getting around that. So I think this opens up room for talking about Pan-African solidarities, for the kinds of political sites of struggle that technology presents, that are very powerful and actually help elevate not only our personhood, but also that get us beyond a conversation about, just the individual and individual consumer behavior and conveniences that really are costing us a lot. I mean, we haven't even scratched the surface of what large-scale AI modeling costs us in terms of environment. But that is very important because we know that Black and Brown people, Indigenous people all over the world are paying the highest price in terms of climate change. So we have an opportunity, I think, to use technology to kind of get out of the narrow way in which the big tech companies have sold us a bill of goods that we can get excited about, and really have the real conversations, which is actually Black people's superpower as far as I'm concerned. We are incredible truth tellers because we see things that other people don't see because of the way in which they hit us and hit our communities. And so maybe I'll leave it there and just say it's really been an honor to be in conversation with you gentlemen today, and I hope we keep this conversation going.
Well, thank you so much, Sylvester. You are at one space. You're at the administrative level, right? So you're able to sort of work certain levers in the academy that speak sort of directly to crafting learning environments that tackle that specific issue, right? And crafting them in a way that brings in how we as people and our how we see ourselves as people in a very sort of individual way, and then in a community way, in connection with technology and the ill and the good of what can be done. Can you briefly tell us what it is in your center that you're looking to focus on? And then what I want to do as the last question is, each of you tell us. Philip, I'll begin with you, and I'm going to end with you, Safiya. Tell us what it is you're doing, and what it is you are going to be doing. Where will people be able to find you? So that'll be my last question. Sylvester, tackle that issue, and then tell us what your latest work is and what you'll be doing.
Yeah, no, just again, very briefly, really honored to be part of this conversation. Thank you so much for even launching SIDGE and engaging with this issue as the kind of organization that you're leading, because it's so important. I'll try to just take 1 minute literally and say that one of the things that our center is doing is hosting a Tech for Humanities Summit, where we want to bring together and co-convene some individuals who might not typically be in the room together to examine some of the future challenges, near future and long-term challenges and opportunities for bringing ethical governance to technology. That's going to depend a lot on bringing together people and having at the table people who have the most to lose when things go wrong. That kind of approach is always going to give you better results than not having that approach, even if the end result's not perfect. In other words, inclusive and diverse strategies to bring more BIPOC peoples and underrepresented peoples to be stakeholders and have inputs into shaping this future is one key thing that we're trying to do. And that summit that's happening this summer is going to be one example of that. We don't have a lot of time, I'll stop there, but it's an example of one of the things that we're doing.
Great. Philip, what are you doing? What will you be doing? Because you got a big joint on your joint. So you're doing your thing, but sort of what's very briefly, the next step in your process there at Iliff?
Sure. So really quickly, I just want to say grateful to be in the space with these wonderful scholars and just to share and these ideas. You can't get this anywhere really else. And so in terms of what I'm doing right now, we're putting into practice the phase around the Black language data set and the Black language model. So we're compiling that list of, again, poems, plays, and speeches and books and whatnot. I mean, if anybody watching has any, things that they want contributed specifically to this data set, I'd love to hear from you. So, feel free to hit me up for that. But I'm also working on building out this particular type of Black posthumanism that I'm describing into kind of a book-length text. So those are kind of the two main things I'm working on right now.
Great. Safiya, what are you doing there at the Center for Race and Digital Justice that you'll be doing over the next year or so that we can connect with?
Well, if anyone wants to find us there, we're digitaljustice.ucla.edu. This is a new center at UCLA that I'm leading that is really about connective tissue between people like us and others, our colleagues, and community organizers, scholars, policymakers, journalists, people who are invested in kind of confronting and dealing with and grappling with issues at the intersection of technology, power, and racial justice. And there's lots of room. It's a big tent. We have hired a number of amazing cutting-edge Black women scholars here, but we are not exclusively Black women scholars, but we are making space for people who do this kind of work, because many of us know that we are kind of unicorns in the institutions that we work in, and we don't often find other people who speak our language. So this is a place where we are really trying to network and build and strengthen power among organizations and researchers working in the space.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Safiya Noble, Sylvester Johnson, and Philip Butler, sort of three leaders in this space. I mean, gee whiz. But we only got to scratch the surface. So look, if you want to learn more, go to our site at NorcalMLKFoundation.org/SIDGE, SIDGE/SIDGE, NorcalMLKFoundation.org/SIDGE. You will learn more about the Center for Social Impact, Development, and Global Engagement there. But to learn more about what we will be doing this weekend during the Martin Luther King celebrations here in the San Francisco Bay Area, go to sfmlk.events. That's sfmlk.events. You'll see all of the 25 or 30 or so things that we have going there. But I want to thank our entire panel here. They are people that have rapidly become pretty close to me, and thinking about this idea of technology and ethics and what it means to be Black and brown in this space, and what we are currently doing in each of these spaces to change and then to push forward into a future that includes us all. So thank you very much.